Hi everyone, it's Mrs. Wallace. I just wanted to take a few minutes to do some of the free response questions for the factor market and just answer any questions that you might have about them. We really didn't get to go over them in class, and sometimes it's helpful if you just have a question, you might see somebody else do the question. So this is the 2010 question. It starts out with the John Lamb Company. It's a profit maximizing firm, and it's producing widgets. This is telling me what it's doing in the product market. It's a perfectly competitive widget market, so that means in the product market, this would be perfectly competitive. We're also going to assume John Lamb employs a fixed number of employees and rents a machine for a variable number of hours from a perfectly competitive factor market, okay? Because we know that he is in the market for capital, we know that it's a factor market. So part A, I'm simply going to be graphing. We're doing side-by-side graphs for the factor market for machines and for John Lamb, and I have to outline the equilibrium rental price labeled as PR, and I also have to do the equilibrium rental price for John Lamb's firm, and the quantity, I have to do the quantity of machines. So I'll start out by just noting there is a factor market. The demand for the factor from all of the firms that are like John Lamb's who are renting the same machine, the supply of the various machines. We can see that there is a market quantity, and there is also a market rent, or the price of the factor resource. So this is like the rental price. We also know that John Lamb will be having to see that rental price as a cost. So the marginal resource cost for John Lamb will be equal to the rental price for the machine, and we know that there will be a marginal revenue product for this particular machine and its variable hours, okay? And I know that this will be the quantity where MRC equals MRP. This will be the quantity, and they want us to label it as QL, so I'll go ahead and do that. We'll just make it QL here, okay? So we have checked off the various things that we need, the quantity of machines for John Lamb. This is John Lamb, and this is the market, okay? So we needed the price in the market, and we needed the quantity for John Lamb. If I go to section B, assume the popularity of widgets. Now this is in the product market. This is not the machine that makes widgets. This is the widget itself. Assume the popularity of widgets declines. So if the firm is making widgets, or all of the firms in the market, are making widgets, and we see the demand decrease, okay, we know that that would lead to a price decrease. A price decrease is going to have an impact on my firm's factor market because it is derived demand. The demand for this machine is connected to the demand for widgets, okay? So for part B, part I, what will happen to the marginal product curve? This is going to be no change because it's the price of the widget that's changing. There's no change at all to the productivity that this machine is offering. If it was a worker, if it's a factor, there's no change in productivity unless I'm given that information. Rather, it's a price change in the product market. However, the MRP will actually change if we know that there's increasing demand and the price is going down. We know that the MRP will decrease, and the reason for that is the widget price is going to decrease, okay? I might write that in a full sentence if I had more space, but that's the idea. For part C, John Lamb is employing cost minimizing combination of inputs, okay? This is least cost. This is the formula that's going to be, the marginal product of labor over the, wage essentially for workers, or the price of labor, or should be equal to the marginal product of capital over the price of capital. We'll kind of keep it as price of capital, price of labor. But in any case, if I was going to just figure this out, I need to know what is the hourly rental price of the machine. Well, if it's 28 widgets per worker and the wage rate is 14, and I know that it tells me the marginal product of labor is 28 widgets per worker, the wage rate is $14 an hour, the marginal product of the machine is 60. Okay, so that's going to go in my numerator there. What will be the rental price? Because 28 over 14 is 2, and if this firm is definitely least cost, these two fractions would have to be equivalent to each other. So if my fraction on the left is 2, my fraction on the right also has to be 2, meaning the rental price of the machine would have to be $30, okay? I hope that that helps. We'll do some more of these questions in the next slide. Hello, everyone. I'm going to do this next question. I actually think this is one of the more challenging questions that exists on this entire set of free response questions. So we have the table below shows the output a firm produces. So output, think of that as quantity or marginal product, total product, okay? Output a firm produces, that means like in the product market, right? The output a firm produces using different amounts of capital and labor, okay? So we've got two resources here, capital and labor. The markets for capital and labor are perfectly competitive. The rental rate of capital is $75 a unit. The wage rate is $200 per unit. So I know that I have two marginal resource costs, right? One for capital at $75 per unit, and the wage rate is $200 per unit. And I know that labor and capital are both perfectly competitive, so they will be constant. In the short run, capital is fixed and labor is variable, okay? The very first question is actually a very, very tricky one because it depends on a particular term, okay? So we're going to put part A here. If the, and let's note for a second what this particular chart is telling us, okay? The chart is telling us output, so quantity that I actually get, total output, based on how many resources I'm using. So if I have no labor, zero labor, and one machine, I get no output. You know, zero labor and two machines, I get no output. Once I hire the first worker and I have one worker using one machine, I get an output of 10. If it's one worker with two machines, I get an output of 20. Two workers with one machine is 25 output. That's what they make in total. If I have two workers and two machines, they're making 50 of the product. If I have three workers and now I have one machine, three workers and one machine, 38 is the output, and three workers and two machines can give me a total of 75, okay? Total product of 75 units of whatever product is being produced. If the firm uses 1 unit of capital and 1 unit of labor, okay, so I'm looking like somewhere like right here, will it be operating at constant, increasing, or decreasing returns to scale, okay? Returns to scale has to do with economies and diseconomies of scale. This is my long run ATC curve. I have a downward sloping portion, economies of scale, a upward sloping portion, diseconomies of scale. If I want to use the phrase increasing and decreasing returns to scale, there is a specific definition of that. If I double my resources, so imagine I double my resources and my output, okay, is going to be greater than double, okay, that is increasing returns to scale. If I double my resources and my output is going to be less than double, that's decreasing returns to scale. If I double my resources and my output doubles, that's constant returns to scale, okay? It also looks like the graph that I drew over here on the left, okay? Now, if I look at, I'm producing with one worker and one machine and I'm making 10. If I double my workers and do 2 workers and double my machines and do 2 machines and 2 workers can produce 50. So I've doubled my resources, but my output has more than doubled. That is going to be increasing returns to scale. If I wanted to look at this and write out the whole thing, increasing returns to scale. If I wanted to use numbers from the table, I would do what I just said and said if I double my output, double my resources from, one worker and 1 capital to 2 workers and 2 capital, my output will go from 10 to 50, which is more than double. Another way I could do this is I could look at the graph and say, okay, this is my long run ATC. Where might I be able to figure out if at this point of production, I am seeing a curve that is decreasing, or increasing, what's happening to the long run ATC. And I can figure that out also because I know the cost to the firm of labor and capital, right? So I can actually figure out if I'm using 1 unit of labor, it's going to cost me $200. If I'm using 1 unit of capital, it's going to cost me $75. So $275 in costs divided by the quantity that I'm actually going to be producing at that cost, my ATC is going to be $27.50, okay? If I say, okay, now what happens when I double my resources? So I'm going to double my resources, and I'm going to imagine that I'm now producing with 2 workers, 400 is the total cost, plus 2 machines, that's going to cost $150. Now my total cost is $550. And instead of making 10, I'm making 50, right? So my ATC is actually going to decrease, and it's going to be $11.50, okay? So I'm seeing that I can actually have increasing returns to scale, because as I'm doubling my resources, my ATC is decreasing. I'm in this portion, okay? In economies of scale, that's one of the things that tells me, okay? Increasing and decreasing returns to scale specifically means if you double your resources, what happens to your output? It's either going to more than double, stay the same, or less than double. Another way that I can do these next few questions, so I'm just going to kind of make some space here. If I go to BI, calculate the marginal product for the 3rd unit of labor, okay? Well, I know that if I had 2 units of labor, and the 2 units of labor, and we're told, right, that in the beginning of this problem, that the firm is using 2 units of capital and 3 units of labor, okay? So I know I'm using 2 units of capital and 3 units of labor, so I'm producing a total output of 75. When I go to hire that 3rd worker from the 2nd worker, do I have a marginal product? Yes, my marginal product is going to be 25. So I know my marginal product for the 3rd worker is 25. That additional worker is adding an additional 25. 2 workers and 2 capitals, 50. 3 workers and 2 capitals, 75. It has to be coming from that 3rd worker. Did the firm experience diminishing marginal returns with the addition of the 3rd unit of labor? Well, I have to be able to decide that based on looking at if I know the 3rd worker created a marginal or added a marginal product of 25 of the unit of the product, the 2nd worker, what was their marginal product? It's either going to be greater or less than 25, or the same. Well, if I look at between 20 and 30, okay, this 2nd worker with 2 capital had a marginal product of 30. So 30 to 25, that's definitely diminishing marginal returns. The answer is yes, and I could use the numbers, from the table. The 3rd worker, adds 25 units. The 2nd worker had added 30. This is clearly diminishing marginal returns because 25 is less than 30. Calculate the firm's average total cost for the current level of production and show your work. So let's do this down here. I know that I have 2 costs, right? One is going to be labor and the other is going to be capital, right? So I'm just going to add all these costs together to find out total costs. The labor cost, if I'm looking at part B, the firm is doing 2 units of capital and 3 units of labor, 3 times 200, right? Plus 2 times 75. If I add this together, that should be my total cost. So I'm going to get 600 plus 150 is 750 because I'm purchasing, 2 machines at $75 a piece, 3 workers at $200 a piece. And the only thing I need to know at this point to figure out ATC, because this is total cost, what is my average total cost? How many am I producing of the unit in the product market? Okay, so this is a product market question. How much am I producing? I'm producing 75. The cost of every single one of those 75 on average is $10. Okay, so I can figure out part B3I, right, is $10. I'm running out of space for this very last one, but if the firm's output is sold in a competitive market, what is the lowest output price at which the third unit of labor would be hired? Okay, so here I can kind of figure out if the firm's output is sold in a competitive market, what's the lowest output price? Okay, so this is a product market, what is the price in the product market when I hire this third unit of labor, okay? And I know it's in a perfectly competitive product market. What's the lowest price? So I know that the way that I could do this, I can look at if I am selling in a competitive market, and I know that the firm, let's see, I'm just looking back at the top of the question, okay. Okay, if I know that I am producing 2 units of capital, 3 units of labor, and my MRC is equal to my MRP, okay? One way I can do this is knowing that my MRC for the third unit of labor is 200. My MRP is going to be the marginal product, which I figured out already, which is 25, times the price of the product. The price of the product would have to be $8 in order for this to be true. Okay, so the price of the product at $8, and that's how you can do that question. Okay, I hope that's clear. I'll see you in class. Okay, everyone, I'm just going to do this next problem. This is a problem that is called, it's the 2014 free response question, raise stable, hires workers in a perfectly competitive factor market for unskilled labor. So this is going to be a labor market, and as usual, our very first part is going to be to graph, okay? And we're asked to correctly label side-by-side graphs for the market and also raise stable. So I know I'm going to be doing the market and the firm, and then there's specific things that I have to showcase. So this is my market. Sorry, my curves are a little bit wacky. This is the demand curve. This is the supply curve, and this would give us the quantity of workers. So this means on the x-axis we have unskilled workers, and this would be the demand and the supply for, that particular market, all unskilled workers. There is a wage in this market based on the interaction between supply and demand. So the wage is here, and of course that market wage is then taken up by the firm, and this is raise stable, okay? And this firm will see a constant marginal resource cost, which is also the supply curve. This is also the wage. The wage is equal to the marginal resource cost, which is equal to supply curve. Think of it like this. The firm is taking the market wage because the firm has no individual control over the wage. There's so many competitors in this market who are hiring for unskilled workers, and the firm sees this as a marginal resource cost because for every next worker that gets hired, the first worker, the second worker, the third and the fourth, and so on, we have an additional cost. The second worker will cost the wage. The third worker will cost the additional wage. The fourth worker will cost the additional wage, okay? So for every single next worker, there's an additional cost, and it's going to be equal to that constant wage. There's also an MRP curve that's downward sloping. The MRP curve, remember, is connected to, this is really the demand curve for the firm, because with this MRP curve, regardless what the wage is, what the wage would be, I know exactly how many employees I would hire, okay? So regardless of what the wage is, I can use the MRP curve just as any demand curve. I can know exactly what the quantity demanded would be for raise stable, okay? Regardless of whether the wage was higher or lower than what it is now. So the question that I'm asked is to make sure that I'm labeling W, and do look at their convention. So if they say we'll use, QM or QS or whatever it is, use their conventions. And then for raised stable, I have to also do this. So, you know, this is Q, this is going to be the Q, where MRC equals MRP. This is going to be, I'm numbering it. Instead of 3 workers, you would be labeling this. This is the quantity of workers that would be hired, because where MRC equals MRP, that tells me our quantity. For B is the factor, the marginal factor cost of unskilled labor for raised stable greater than, less than, or equal to the wage. We know that this marginal resource cost, it's the same thing. This word factor and resource can be used interchangeably. So the marginal resource cost is actually going to be equal to the wage. Okay, so we know that the answer to B will be that they will be the same or equal. Explain that. If we had to explain that for B, if I wanted to explain, and you want to make sure you do the explain when you get your free response question, take the time to underline all the explains so that you don't miss them. This would be very much straightforward. You would just say maybe something like, the firm is a wage taker because there is a great deal of competition, great deal, I forgot deal, but great deal of competition for the factor, okay, or for labor, okay? It is a wage taker, so you're just explaining that. Now assume that the government imposes an effective minimum wage for unskilled labor, okay? So this effective minimum wage is first going to be imposed in the market, okay? I'm just going to change my color here. So this is going to be the minimum wage, okay? Now, I want to note something here. This is the wage, that is the minimum wage. Show the minimum wage on your graph and label it, you know, W minimum. Okay, so that red line is now my minimum wage. For part C2I, on the labor market graph in part A, show the quantity of unskilled labor supplied. Okay, now they're asking for labor supplied. Yesterday, Mustafa asked me a question about what quantity would be produced if this question to a C2I was what quantity would be produced in the market. The quantity produced would be where the quantity demanded is. This is the quantity that's effectively produced. Remember, minimum wage is a price floor. It's a price control above equilibrium. It leads to deadweight loss, okay? However, they're asking for labor supplied. So they don't want to know what would the market actually produce and is there deadweight loss. They're actually asking, is there going to be, so I'm just going to take care of that. The answer to the question is, where is the quantity supplied? Well, the quantity supplied is here, okay, where my red Q is. The quantity demanded would be here where this quantity is, okay, and this is the quantity that they're looking for in order to answer, you know, this question. Just recognize, just to remind you, that whenever you have a quantity supplied that's greater than quantity demanded, what's suggested here is we would have a surplus, and in this case we have a surplus of workers, more workers who say, I will work at that really high wage. Lots of unskilled workers come out of the woodwork to work at that high wage, but there's not that many positions that are being hired at firms, so the quantity demanded is low. If we ask the question, you know, how many workers will actually be hired, it would be this lower quantity, and we'd have a surplus of workers, and we'd end up with unemployment, which is one of the criticisms of the minimum wage if we have a perfectly competitive labor market, okay? But again, the correct answer that they're looking for, they're just asking for labor supplied. If they had asked for labor demanded, we would be over here. The quantity that's the effective quantity would be this, because you cannot have, you know, the supply. It doesn't matter how much is supplied if only a little bit is actually hired, okay? For parts C3I. As a result of this new minimum wage, what will happen to marginal revenue product? Well, this is another question we can look at with a little bit of a caveat. Because the firm, Raise Stable, is a wage taker, when the minimum wage is increased, it kind of is taking the place of the equilibrium price. So this equilibrium price in the market is no longer effective, only the minimum wage is. And because Raise Stable is a wage taker, they're going to be taking this wage. And so they're going to also have the minimum wage as their higher wage. Now, two questions could be asked. One could be, what would happen to the quantity of workers? Well, we might notice that the MRC curve, or the firm supply curve, has now shifted upward. And as a result of that, we are going to see a different quantity of workers supplied. Actually, fewer workers will be hired, rather, in Raise Stable. The question, however, is not asking how many workers are going to be hired. It's asking, will the marginal revenue product of the last worker hired increase, decrease, or stay the same, okay? Now, if I look at what is the MRP at this point, let's call it A, and the previous point, let's call it B, what was the MRP here? I can see that the MRP for point A is something on the y-axis that's going to be a lot greater, okay? So the MRP increases. The marginal revenue product of the last worker hired is going to be higher, because the more you hire workers, the more marginal product decreases, so you'd have diminishing returns, so more and more and more workers will have diminished marginal revenue product, okay? But because we have a higher wage, we have fewer workers hired, there's no doubt about that, but they're not asking that question. They want to know what's happening to the marginal revenue product, which is going to see an increase because point A on the y-axis is showing us a dollar value of marginal revenue product. Just like any demand curve, the marginal revenue product curve is a series of points, right? And it's kind of coordinated points where, you know, at this higher wage, we have fewer workers, but the wage is going to suggest a higher MRP value, okay? I hope that's clear. Any questions, just let me know. Sorry for my messy handwriting. Hello, everyone. This is the monopsony problem, so let's kind of go through this a little bit. And I did do a video on this in case you have an interest, and there's other videos, of course, out there too. But remember that the monopsony is very similar to the theory of the monopoly. This is the downward sloping demand curve in monopoly. This is the MR curve and the MC curve. So if you remember some of the reasoning that goes into those relationships in the product market, think very much that this is going to be very, very similar. Remember, in the product market, whenever the firm wanted to sell more of the product, they had to decrease the price because there's a downward sloping demand curve, and because the MR is less than demand, we know that the monopolist was always underproducing the good at a higher price than perfect competition would. A lot of that is going to hold true for the monopsonist too. It's just a little bit different of a theory, okay? The idea here is that we have, similar to our perfectly competitive model, we have a firm and we have a market. It's just, in this case, it's all in one graph, okay? The firm is the market. And a monopsony in the labor market, an example of this would be, you know, one firm that is purchasing all of the factor type. So one hospital that's hiring all of the nurses in a 300-mile area, okay, that would be a monopsony. So if you happen to be a nurse in this 300-mile area, you have one choice for employer. You could work at hospital ABC or hospital ABC. You know, that's it, okay? So that's the idea behind a monopsony. It tends to happen most in a labor market, okay? So let's look at the market and the firm for this particular company. Woodland is a small town. Everybody works for this one company called Tremart, the local lumber company. Tremart is a monopsonist in the labor market. perfect competitor in the lumber market. Okay, it's a firm that sells lumber, but it's also hiring workers in the labor market, and it's a monopsonist. We know that this is a firm that has a downward sloping marginal revenue product curve. Okay, this is MRP. This really isn't any different than the perfectly competitive model for the firm, downward sloping MRP that's reflecting, in a sense, right, basically the change in total revenue for every next worker or group of workers. You know, that's really what we're looking at. How much additional value do I get from the hiring of every next worker? In this case, however, we have a supply curve that's upward sloping, and that tells me that every single time I want to hire a new worker for this firm, I have to increase the wage. Okay, I can hire more workers, but I can't, like I could in perfect competitive labor market, I could hire as many workers as I wanted at a constant wage. In this case, I can hire and hire and hire more workers, but I have to increase the wage in order to do that. Okay, we're also going to suggest that this is a firm that's not wage differentiating. In other words, it's not hiring every next worker at a wage different than the worker before. If we assume that every time the firm increases the wage to hire the next worker, they have to increase that wage for all of the workers hired before, that is going to make the marginal factor cost or the marginal resource cost greater than the supply of labor. Okay, so we have an MRC that's not equal to the supply of labor, but is actually greater than the supply of labor. It costs the firm a little bit more for every next employee because they're paying not only a higher wage, but they're also increasing the wage for all of the earlier employees that were already hired. Okay, so the same idea is going to apply here, and we'll just kind of put the answers in the question. Identify the profit maximizing quantity. This is always going to be where MRP is equal to MRC, okay? So in this case, you know, MRC is here and MRP is here. I'm going to travel all the way down. See, that's a quantity of 100, okay? That would be my answer. They don't ask you to explain, so what's the profit maximizing quantity? It's 100 workers, okay? 100 workers who are going to be hired by this particular company. The next question is, what will be the wage rate, okay? Resist the urge to go over to the 20 and use 20. This is a firm that not only will hire fewer workers than perfect competition, but also can choose a lower wage. Because the supply curve tells me at a quantity of 100, workers will work for $10. I'm going to use the supply curve, and that is going to be the market wage. Okay, so the market wage is going to be $10 an hour, let's say. Identify the quantity of labor hired at each of the following situations, okay? So the first question is, what would be the quantity of workers if we have a competitive labor market? Well, in a competitive labor market, it would just look like this. We'd have an upward sloping supply curve, a downward sloping demand curve. Remember, this is the market, not the firm. And if this is perfectly competitive, we know that the wage would be here and the quantity would be here. So if this was a perfectly competitive market, MRC would be equal to the supply curve, and we would have a quantity of 200 workers. The supply of labor would be equal to MRC. MRC would equal MRP and be 200, okay? So 200 workers would be hired if we were in a competitive labor market, okay? If they ask what would the wage be in a competitive labor market, it would be $15, would be the equilibrium wage, kind of ignoring the increased, you know, MRC that the monopsony has. If 200 workers were hired at a wage of 15, we would be perfectly competitive labor market. So you can see the monopsony, just like the monopoly in the product market, is inefficient. There is deadweight loss, and they are hiring fewer workers at a lower wage, okay? Not really good situation for the workers. This next question has to do with what happens if there is a minimum wage of $12.50. And this is kind of interesting because in the typical market, we'll draw it again, demand and supply, whenever you have a minimum wage, we know that as a price floor, this essentially creates arguably some unemployment. If this is the equilibrium wage here, and the minimum wage is greater, it's very possible that the quantity supplied of workers, more workers are willing to work than the quantity that would be hired by firms, so we end up with a surplus of workers and we end up with unemployment. That's like a common argument against the minimum wage. Some economists would say, but wait a minute, what if we apply a minimum wage to a monopsony market, as long as we're not increasing the wage so high above the equilibrium wage, right? But if we're getting a wage that's low of $10, what happens if we make the wage $15, or in this case, $12.50? So if we kind of look at, this is my minimum wage, okay? This is the wage, okay? And if I consider all the way up until this point, now I would be hiring this quantity of workers, what is going to be 150 workers, okay? How do I know that that's the quantity? Well, as soon as I want to hire the 151st worker, I know that I would have to increase my wage in order to hire that next worker. That's what the supply curve of labor is telling me. So I can't hire beyond 150 workers, okay? And to give you an idea, in a sense, you're looking at your minimum wage, and this kind of line here, that's kind of like your supply curve for labor. At this point, your MR, like before 150, the quantity of 150, we don't really have an MRC. There's just the $12.50. That is the cost of the wage, right? But as soon as you get to 150 workers and you go to hire the 151st worker, the firm would be in the same pickle. It would have to hire greater numbers of workers at an increased wage, and it would have an MRC greater than it would have an MRC greater than the supply curve, okay? So, this minimum wage, in a sense, is like your like your cost, in a sense, for the firm up until the point of 150 workers, okay? I hope that helps. I will answer any questions that you have. Just send me an email.